Okay, ladies, this screencast is going to pick up in Chapter 4 with Pontiac's Rebellion, which is going to be a key event taking place after the French and Indian War had been won by the British. So the natives obviously were on Team France during the French and Indian War, so they were upset when the British won instead of the French. The natives have a more complicated relationship with the English, and they are not in favor of the English gaining more territory. So as a result of the British victory, the Native American chief Pontiac will lead a rebellion against the British. That rebellion is called Pontiac's Rebellion. It's a native rebellion. And the British are eventually able to put this rebellion down, and they eventually reach a peace settlement where the British do get the acknowledgement from the natives that, okay, yes, this land that has been won in the Ohio River Valley, that is now British territory. So the natives kind of accept the British claims to the land, but they get something as well. And the something that they get is known as the Proclamation Line of 1763. If you see the line that's drawn on the screen, it's really just the western border of the already established 13 colonies. King George III issued this line and basically stated that no colonists could settle west of that line. They used the Appalachian Mountains that cut through that area as the boundary, so the colonists were no longer allowed to settle west of the line. How do you think the colonists feel about not being able to settle and relocate on the land that they have just been fighting for and won? So they are not happy with this and not very happy with the king. Okay, kind of looking at the legacy of the French and Indian War in its role in causing the American Revolution. There are a lot of problems kind of stemming from the French and Indian War. During the war, the British and colonial troops are not getting along very well. Even though they're all English, the British kind of look down on the colonists, and the colonists kind of look at the British soldiers as snobby. And then also, if you kind of recall the navigation acts that were put in place initially, where England is trying to ensure that the mother country is primarily profiting off of the colonies, a lot of the colonists had kind of ignored the rules and the taxes for so long, and during the period of salutary neglect, they're getting away with that. But when the British soldiers were fighting the war, they were tattling on the colonists and telling the crown what was happening with all the smuggling of goods. Also, an issue stemming from the war, George III left a very large army in the colonies, even when the war was over. How do you think that makes the colonists feel about how the king trusts them or doesn't trust them? So there's kind of tension remaining at the end of the war. And lastly, and the most important factor here, is national debt. Yes, England won the war, but wars are expensive. So England finds itself in a lot of debt after the French and Indian War, and they will be turning to the colonies as a way to make some of that money back and pay some of that debt off. Keep in mind that all these four factors together are the reason we look at the French and Indian War as being the kind of pinnacle event that will eventually lead to the American Revolution. Because of all these issues that are stemming from the result of the French and Indian War, all those issues together will create the cause and effect, reaction, chain events that lead to the American Revolution. And it's all going to start with the Sugar Act. I wanted to quickly introduce the Freedom Trail emblem in Boston, since Boston's going to be the setting for many of our events in this chapter. I'll kind of address this in class on Monday, but several of the key events I have taken pictures of when I've been able to travel to Boston. And if you've gone yourself, it's a place of a lot of history. So we'll see actual images of some of the things we're talking about in this chapter. So Prime Minister in England decides it's time to start taxing the colonists in an effort to help pay for the war and pay off the war debt. After all, it's fought in the colonies to keep the land, so why shouldn't the colonies have to pay? To be fair, he's taxing the British citizens too. Okay, it's not just the colonies getting taxed, but the colonists are not going to be happy about it anyway. So he passes what's called the Sugar Act, which actually reduced the tax that was already in place on imported sugar. If you kind of recall, part of the Navigation Acts were that things that were being imported from other countries were being taxed heavily by England, which causes their price to go up. In order to avoid the tax, many colonists had just been not paying it and smuggling in their own sugar. But now that England knows that that's been happening, and all the smuggling's been happening, and all the laws have been broken, the Prime Minister will come in with the Sugar Act, where he actually lowers the tax in hopes that the colonists will be willing to pay this lowered tariff. Also, he penalizes those that he catches smuggling. But the colonists are unhappy about any kind of tax, even if it's a lowered one, because they feel they are not being properly represented in Parliament, the government in England that's passing all these laws. If they're not being represented, they feel they shouldn't have to obey these types of increased or even decreased taxes. So if you know the battle cry, no taxation without representation, you know where it stems from. Okay, so they're not happy about the Sugar Act. In order to raise even more money, Parliament will eventually pass what's called the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was a tax that was placed on all paper items in the colonies. So court documents, playing cards, newspapers, contracts, wills, you basically had to pay the tax, and then that item was stamped to prove that you paid the tax on it, which is why it's called the Stamp Act, because certain of those things required stamps, just like a mailing letter today. At the same time, Parliament is also going to pass what is called the Quartering Act, where the colonists had to provide food and housing for British soldiers in the colonies, which, recall, there are increased numbers of British soldiers in the colonies because King George left the army there. How do you think that the colonists feel about these increased taxes or decrease with the Sugar Act, but then also the fact that they're having to pay to house and feed men? Men like to eat. That can get expensive. So the colonists view these practices as very unfair. Really, we've moved away from salutary neglect, where now the British are here and they're in it to win it, and they're here to kind of run things themselves without any sort of input from the colonial assemblies. And that's making the colonists angry, which will lead to a group of people develop called the Patriots. Patriots would be advocates for colonial rights, for the colonial cause, a defender of American and colonial rights, okay? A group of patriots is going to organize what was called the Stamp Act Congress, where they basically issue a list of grievances about what English Parliament was doing to them. They are sending, basically Parliament a list of their issues that they have with the Sugar Act, with the Stamp Act, and they kind of also make it clear they have no intention of rebelling. They're trying to make peace here. They're trying to reason in this Stamp Act Congress with England. They're not trying to threaten rebellion. Okay, this shows peaceful discourse overall, which is very much the intention. The colonists would love to remain English. They just want England to respect their rights. Unfortunately, not all colonists were as non-confrontational. Some were a bit more aggressive with their methods of protest against some of these British laws, and one very radical resistant group was known as the Sons of Liberty, founded by Samuel Adams. He's pictured on the screen. You may know the name John Adams. He is distant cousin to John Adams. Maybe not distant, maybe second or third. I'm not sure. Don't worry about it. Point is, the Sons of Liberty were a little bit more radical in their protest methods. They called for boycotts of British goods. They weren't writing letters. They were taking action. They are also the individuals that will tar and feather British officials and tax collectors. They took out some more aggressive action against the British officials in the colonies. All right, we're going to stop here today because that was a good bit of information. If you have any questions, please write it down, and we will go over in class on Monday. Y'all have a great weekend.